Hello, History 17B Spring Quarter 24. I am waiting for my face to go back to normal, so you're not seeing me still at the beginning of the lecture, but hopefully we'll get there at some point. I also have a post-op checkup tomorrow, and I'm trying to get videos in just in case they tell me I've done bad things and have to have something redone. Hopefully not. All right. Lecture 11. Wealth inequality was a feature of the Second Industrial Revolution in both Europe and the US, as were urban slums. The difference was that London slums had to fit into a city that had already been a city for centuries. Most American cities were not established places that had to fit extra people in. Slums with different kinds of tenements or housing developed as a city formed and grew in most places. Even cities like New York and Pittsburgh were relatively new. Places like Chicago and Detroit had space to expand sideways, as it were. This is tenement housing in Chicago that you're looking at on the slide. Notice that there is no kind of brick or stone foundation under the buildings, and that you can see standing water in the right foreground. This is also Chicago. Foundations, such as they were, consisted of cedar stumps driven into the ground. Chicago roads also used wood as opposed to cobblestones or brick. Chicago is often wet, which means that tenements and roads were often soggy, and wood tends to rot, not to hold up well in these conditions. Landlords bought land cheap, put as many rooms as possible on it as quickly as possible, and raked in rent money. As with factory jobs, tenants were replaceable as more immigrants and migrants arrived. There was no financial impetus to maintaining residents or buildings, so most landlords didn't. The issue of what to do with the poor became central in the late 19th to early 20th century. Ideas about how to help the poor tended to vary by class. We will look at the middle class in a couple of lectures because middle class activism would have repercussions for the size and scope of governments, from municipal to federal. We've seen that poor workers formed unions to try to solve their problems on their own terms. We also know that union actions were often rejected, if not violently suppressed, by owners and high government officials alike. So, what sort of plans did the wealthy have for dealing with the issue of rampant and growing poverty in the US? Many of you in your quiz answers pointed out that part of the reason that unions failed in the era of the Knights of Labor and the push for the 8-hour workday was a lack of cohesion among workers. Going into the 1890s and Module C now, one example of an extremely tightly unified union was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. I am just going to call it the Amalgamated from here on. The Amalgamated formed at Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steelworks in Pittsburgh. You have Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth as a primary source in your YOP chapter on capital and labor. I think that a number of you may discuss it in section as well. Carnegie is often praised for this statement that it is the duty of the rich to see to the well-being of the poor. So to quote Carnegie, of such as these, men who cling to wealth, the public verdict will be, the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. Carnegie also sketched out a difference between charity, which he viewed as giving money without control over how it was spent, and philanthropy, in which the one with the money sees that it is spent in accordance with their values for the greater good of the poor. Carnegie was indeed quite philanthropic. So why did he deem it necessary to break the amalgamated, one of the most effective collective bargaining groups to emerge in the increasingly industrialized United States. Let's contextualize his rather self-congratulatory opinions on one discourse of progress, popular in the progressive era, along with the discourse of civilization. When Carnegie said, quote, "It is well, nay, essential for the progress of the race, that the houses of some should be homes for all that is highest and best in literature and the arts, and for all the refinements of civilization, rather than that none should be so," as if those were the only choices. When Carnegie said this, was this really admiration of fine arts and artists? What was going on here? Civilization discourse is still embedded in the idea of progress. It was way too easy to find this graphic now when we are almost a quarter of the way into the 21st century. That tells you, like the melting pot screen, how effective the discourse of the 19th century has been in shaping our worldview, mostly without us realizing it. This graphic is well-meaning in terms of pushing for ecological ideas. It's also extremely patronizing and shows a 19th century understanding of the ways that humans organize themselves. So it starts with primitive civilization, backward technology, low consumption, coexistence between man, like it would have killed them to put an HU and make it human, and nature. Note the primitive and the backward. Never used those in my class. Then we get agricultural civilization, farming, domestication, population increase, regional disharmony, industrial civilization, high productivity, high efficiency. You should recognize those as Gilded Age ideas there. Heavy pollution, high consumption. We talked about consumption, ecological disruption. And then they are saying that we should be heading for ecological civilization, high efficiency, high technology, low consumption, low pollution, overall coordination, recycling and renewal, health and sustainability. All of these rather admirable. The problem here is that this is an average that describes only one set of cultures. For an ecological aspiration, this chart seems rather ignorant of the reality of vast ecological variation, much less its relationship to human social variability. This is a one-way track going from negative bad things to enlightened, from primitive to advanced. I think that many of you have heard of social Darwinism, the idea that among both bodies and cultures, the supposedly best prevails. This was used as an excuse for imperialism by both white Americans and Europeans. Both the image and the Carnegie quote here are in keeping with that, quoting Carnegie. "When visiting the Sioux," whom we saw in the last lecture, "I was led to the wigwam of the chief. It was just like the others in external appearance, and even within the difference was trifling between it and those of the poorest of his braves. The contrast between the palace of the millionaire and the cottage of the laborer with us today measures the change which has come with civilization." It sounds so much better and makes us feel better to say, "Lucky you, I'm bringing you civilization because I am the pinnacle of what the Lord intended," as opposed to "rough luck. I've got ships and guns and, most to the point, no scruples about taking what you have, including your lives. So get your equitable nonsense out of here." I want to point out that social Darwinism was not just racist, sexist, and imperialist. It also made no real-world logical sense. But the whole survival of the fittest ideology still colors social and scientific discussion now. So let's take a look. Here is one of the major problems with a survival of the fittest model. This is what people think natural selection and evolution look like if they have bought into the 19th century survival of the fittest idea. The landscape does not change, and one species outcompetes the other. Competition is important here. There is no way to be fit other than winning. This is more along the lines of what evolution actually looks like. If you are listening, it's several images from a kaleidoscope. The environment is not static, in part because it is made up of many different types of species, all trying to survive and reproduce at the same time. Everything is changing at once, so there can never be a perfect adaptation or form, just something that is good enough at any point in time. The idea of a fittest anything is nonsensical in the actual world. Wherever you decide to start looking, you have a bunch of species, each of which is part of the environment of all of the others. And those are going to change in a constantly changing environment made up of a bunch of constantly changing species in a shifting physical landscape. And what you will end up with is a bunch of species that were just good enough or lucky enough to survive and reproduce to this specific snapshot of time. Americans and Europeans of the late 19th century also saw technological developments and industrialization as proof that humans could control any natural process with enough science. In other words, with progress toward higher civilization. People with power and wealth in Europe and the United States used the idea of a process of evolution leading to the best version of humanity to justify social and national inequity. The reasoning went like this. If people were colonized, it was because they were weak and primitive. Incidentally, this image here is actually celebratory of colonialism. But going back to the reasoning, if people were colonized, it was because they were weak and primitive. If people were poor, it was because they were inferior or degenerate. With this mindset, wealthy white men could convince themselves, if not everyone else, that they were wealthy and powerful because they were the best, the fittest, the closest to the pinnacle of evolution, or the smartest capitalist, or the most discerning art connoisseur. In other words, they deserved better everything because they themselves were better. Quoting Carnegie again, we accept and welcome, therefore, as conditions to which we must accommodate ourselves, great inequality of environment, the concentration of business, industrial and commercial, in the hands of a few, and the law of competition between these as being not only beneficial, but essential for the future progress of the race. I have heard people say that by race, Carnegie meant the human race. And he did, in the sense that, in this view, only white civilized folks were fully human. This is a rather long quote on the slide here, but it is at the heart of Carnegie's worldview. So I will read it in its entirety here, but then break it into pieces while I go over the treatment of the amalgamated and the homestead strike. Andrew Carnegie. This then is held to be the duty of the man of wealth. First, to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display or extravagance, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him, and after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues, those would be profits, which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is called upon to administer and strictly bound as a matter of of duty to administer in the manner which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community. The man of wealth thus becomes the mere agent and trustee for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer, doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves. You saw this slide on the last lecture without the quote, and in fact, this is why I structured that lecture as I did. This is the first part of our long quote. This then is held to be the duty of the man of wealth, first to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display or extravagance. He does not define those words the way that I do. Now, Carnegie was indeed from modest origins. His father was a weaver who failed in business both in Scotland and in the US. Carnegie was also white, English-speaking, Protestant, and had family in the US already beyond his father. Carnegie worked hard, but he did it in a very limited historical context in which he could actually go from a bobbin boy in a cotton mill to railroad supervisor to one of the guys that his supervisors gave investment advice to, and historical context in which brand new businesses were being established on land acquired by savvy businessmen with the assistance of the U.S. Army. A couple of points about this part of the quote, Carnegie, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him. And I've highlighted a couple of parts there. First, who gets to decide what constitutes legitimate wants? Regardless of right or wrong, the person who lives in the home on the right is claiming that he is the one to decide what the folks on the left should be allowed to want. The other is use of the word dependent. We have been discussing on and off what independence meant on the ground for American men. Being identified as dependent was unlikely to sit well with folks who considered either that they had been born to independence or that they had immigrated in search of said quality. This is, incidentally, if you're listening, Carnegie's mansion on the right, and the Carnegie Steelworks with the housing for the laborers in the front here. Those are apartment buildings, they're not houses. Continuing with Carnegie's quote, and after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is called upon to administer and strictly bound as a matter of duty to administer in the matter which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community. The Amalgamated, the steelworkers union that I started out with, wanted to have a part in what would be calculated to be beneficial to their own community. Thank you very much. In the judgment of Carnegie and his associate Henry Clay Frick, the Amalgamated did not deserve a seat at the table with a say in collective bargaining. Carnegie's reputation as a good guy largely stayed untouched by the events of the ensuing Homestead strike because he empowered Frick to break the union, meaning the Amalgamated, at Homestead. Carnegie himself went to his summer estate in Scotland. That would be this modest building that you see here on the slide. Oh, no, wait. He bought this 5 years after the Homestead strike. Trust fund investment for the workers, of course. To complete the quote, the man of wealth, thus becoming the mere agent and trustee for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer, doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves. On the lower box, this is what Frick, with his superior wisdom and Carnegie's blessing, did when the Amalgamated asked for collective bargaining as a standard part of business practice at the Homestead plant. Note that we're not talking about a strike right now. We're talking about the union being included in collective bargaining. Frick, as Carnegie's associate and representative, canceled contract renewal negotiations with anyone in Amalgamated, refused to negotiate with anyone but individual workers because Frick was going to sit down with all 3,800 of them individually. This is the freedom of contract. Frick also hired 300 Pinkerton agents to patrol the steel mill's perimeter and enclosed the mill in a 12-foot steel fence topped with barbed wire. I will say once again, the request at this point was for collective bargaining. The rest of the story follows a pattern with which we have become familiar over the course of the preceding lectures. The amalgamated members and their families were a tight-knit group, part of what had made the amalgamated more successful than smaller unions, and they were, in fact, coordinated. Basically, the entire town mobilized, barring strike breakers in resources from entering the mill and basically shutting down production. So they are at this point. Frick sent an army of heavily armed Pinkertons, whom the amalgamated and supporters managed to defeat in a 12-hour battle at the cost of 3 Pinkerton agents and 9 strikers' lives. That said, the amalgamated did not have a chance once the Pennsylvania militia joined the Pinkertons. Both the amalgamated and the strike were broken. Frick cabled the absent but philanthropic Carnegie, "Our victory is now complete and more gratifying. Do not think we will have any serious labor trouble again." Here's the thing. The homestead loss wasn't just about immediate demands. It was about the right of the supposed little people to make their own demands on their own behalf, to be treated not just as full citizens, but as functioning adults, rather than particularly troublesome children or dependents. The homestead defeat was heartbreaking, and it was also humiliating. And it sent a clear message to all workers. We, the owners, are better than you. Probably the fastest growing union by the early mid-1890s was the American Railway Union, or ARU. The ARU actually managed to build on the Knights of Labor with adjustments for earlier failures. It helped that railroad workers had been trying out unions and labor action for at least a couple of decades at this point. The Pullman Palace Car Company made railroad cars, not just any old railroad cars, but luxury cars, the kind that the people making them would never actually get to ride in themselves. And if you can't see it, there's lovely Victorian armchairs and curtains and only one chair on each side all the way down the carriage. Pullman was famous for its company town south of Chicago, where its workers lived. From Pullman's perspective, the town was a philanthropic project intended to solve the issue of poverty among his workforce. This was an entire town, and you can see it here on the postcard from the era. This was an entire town with apartments and houses that could be rented by single workers or by workers with families. There was a church and a school and shops and a library so that workers could improve themselves. Sounds great, right? And in some ways it was. Certainly the housing was of higher quality than tenements. So what's not to love? Pullman controlled every aspect of life in the town. Residents had curfews. They were paid in company scrip, not money, and the scrip could only be used for Pullman rentals and goods in Pullman stores. Pullman decided what goods would and would not be offered in their stores and how much people would be required to pay for them. Pullman apparently had spies in town to keep an eye on workers every hour of every day. In the words of one Pullman employee, quote, We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shop, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we shall be buried in the Pullman cemetery and go to the Pullman hell. In the Depression that followed the Panic of 1893, so don't be thinking Great Depression yet, the Depression that followed the Panic of 1893, George Pullman, owner of the Pullman Palace Car Company, laid off 33% of his employees and reduced wages for those he kept by at least 25%. And in a number of cases, he reduced wages up to 40%. Now, despite this, Pullman refused to reduce rents or lower prices in the company store. This is Pullman's modest home on Prairie Avenue in Chicago. Many of the Pullman workers, former workers, and their families were literally facing starvation. The folks in the image on the lower right are not enjoying a nice day at the lakeshore in Chicago. They are starting to set up a shanty town because they have been kicked out of their work for Pullman, which means they've also been kicked out of their Pullman housing. What they have in the world is what you see in the photo. When a delegation of workers tried to present their grievances about low wages, poor living conditions, and 16-hour workdays directly to Pullman, he not only refused to meet with them, but ordered that all the members of the delegation be fired. The delegation then voted to strike, and Pullman workers walked off the job on 11 May 1894. At the time of the strike, 35% of Pullman's workforce was represented by the American Railway Union, the ARU, which I introduced at the beginning half of the lecture as a union that had actually been fairly successful in the early 1890s. The ARU had led a successful strike against the Great Northern Railway Company in April of 1894, just 1 month before the Pullman workers walked out. But in that case, the workers' strike had interrupted railroad travel directly. Pullman employees just stopped producing luxury cars. The ARU had to figure out how to make a bigger impression for the workers. This on the slide is Eugene V. Debs, who was president of the ARU at the time. His big idea was to get the switchmen to support the Pullman strike. Switchmen are called that because they're the ones who switch cars in and out from a train at the station. The plan was that once the switchmen refused to add or remove Pullman cars from trains, the railroads would fire them and try to replace them with non-union workers, and that in turn would lead to other union members to walk out in solidarity, thus bringing more and more trains to a halt. Risking their employment and livelihood is a lot to ask workers to do in support of others with no immediate gain for themselves. But the switchmen did it, and it worked as Debs had planned. On 27 June, 5,000 workers left their jobs and 15 railroads were tied up. By the next day, 40,000 had walked off, and rail traffic was snarled on all lines west of Chicago. On the third day, the number of strikers had climbed to 100,000, and at least 20 lines were either tied up or completely stopped. By 30 June, 125,000 workers on 29 railroads had quit rather than handle Pullman cars. On the one hand, this was an absolutely astounding show of solidarity. On the other hand, once you were looking at more than 100,000 angry people, and you know the history of bosses sending in armed forces and provoking more anger and violence, you are sitting on a very risky powder keg. During the first week of the boycott, Debs actually sent some 4,000 telegrams, hundreds every day, urging the ARU locals to stay calm and not overreact. Nevertheless, I think that you can see where this is going. Skipping over calling in the local militias and local actions, I will point out that this strike was so effective that lack of train service for mail and shipped goods, like from the catalogs in our one live lecture day, was felt across the nation. The federal government under U.S. President Grover Cleveland, so we're up to Cleveland now, obtained an injunction from circuit court judges that prohibited ARU leaders from, quote, compelling or inducing any employees of the affected railroads to refuse or fail to perform any of their duties. Of greater concern, this court injunction also prevented ARU leaders from communicating with their subordinates at all. Thus, Debs, who had been valiantly trying to prevent violence, could no longer even send telegrams advising against violence. Long story short, the strike ended in violence that involved not only police and state troops in the thousands, but 6,000 federal troops as well. Debs tried desperately to call off the strike and to get railroads to allow striking workers to return to their jobs, with no success. Now, troops and violence were not new to this scenario, but using the courts and getting an injunction was new. On 7 July, at the height of the violence, federal officers arrested Debs and 4 other ARU leaders for contempt of court for violating the injunction in trying to calm workers by talking to them, and for criminal conspiracy to interfere with the U.S. mail. Remember, the actual issue that would have stopped all of this was the Pullman workers who were still paying high prices at the Pullman store while being paid a fraction of the wages that they signed on for if they hadn't been fired. After appeals, Debs ended up spending 6 months in jail. We will see Debs again, and we will see him go to prison again, but we will get those stories in other lectures. For now, we will note that every branch of the federal government, executive, legislative, and judicial, had aligned with industry owners rather than push the owners to sit down with workers' chosen representatives. I am going to point out again that phrase, freedom to negotiate a contract, that we heard applied to a business owner in the reading of the 14th Amendment in the Lochner case. Key points to Lecture 11. Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth was part of a larger discourse of civilization that claimed inequality was a natural function of civilizing the world. Carnegie reflected the general opinion of wealthy industrialists that they were richer than other people because they were better than those other people. Part of the failure to work with the unions was greed, but part of it was a patronizing, I know what the lower classes need better than they do attitude. Workers, rather naturally, hated starving, but they also resented being treated as inferiors and basically serfs when they were supposed to be free to form contracts that represented both sides of any employment deal. The Homestead and Pullman strikes show that workers were able to work in a reasonably unified fashion, but that the combination of anger and resentment on the part of the workers, combined with armed troops of one level and or another to control them, still resulted in violence. The conclusion of the 1894 Pullman strike involved the judicial system in the strike-breaking process for the first time. For the coda in this lecture, I want to talk some about Lucy Parsons, the partner in many senses of the word of Albert Parsons, who was hanged after the Haymarket riots. She is an excellent example of the decisions and contradictions that make up a real life. Information on her can vary greatly from source to source, not only in secondary sources, but in material produced during her own life, in some cases by her. Sources on her early childhood are extremely muddled by Lucy Parsons' own desire. Some say she was born in Waco, Texas, that you can see on the map here, but most agree that she was born in Virginia to an enslaved woman named Charlotte. Some sources say that her father was also enslaved, most that she was the daughter of her enslaver, whose name and story are actually reasonably traceable. Some sources say that her mother escaped with her to Waco, Texas. Others that her father enslaver took them with him to Texas and they were freed at the end of the Civil War. And still others that they only went to Waco after the Civil War. Regardless, everyone agrees that as a young adult, Lucy Parsons was in Waco, Texas. Lucy Parsons gave her own ancestry as Mexican and Native American. This is in no way incompatible with being born to an enslaved woman in the mid-19th century. This is a moment only insofar as she quite deliberately denied having any Black ancestry. Given the reality of the world she lived in, this is one of those decisions that she made to navigate her life. She may or may not have been married before she met Albert Parsons, but from the point that they were married, there are rich records of their lives. Albert Parsons had actually been a soldier in the Confederate Army, but by Reconstruction, he was a staunch radical Republican. Lucy and Albert were married in Texas just before Texas's anti-miscegenation laws went into effect. These would have prevented their marriage as he was considered white and she was considered not white. There's some debate about whether their marriage was technically legal or not, but it is rather a moot point. They considered themselves married, and they left Texas fairly soon after anyway. He edited a radical Republican newspaper, and she was outspoken on social justice issues. They were neither popular nor safe in Texas. From 1873, both of the Parsons actively supported social justice and workers' rights issues. You can go to Lecture 6, Part 2 for the Haymarket Affair and the execution of Albert Parsons. After his death, Lucy Parsons became a more visible activist in her own right. The quote on the slide is from a talk that she gave in 1886. She said, "I am an anarchist. I suppose some of you came here, most of you, to see what I, a real live anarchist, looked like. I suppose some of you expected to see me with a bomb in one hand and a flaming torch in the other, but are disappointed in seeing neither. If such has been your ideas regarding an anarchist, you deserve to be disappointed. Anarchists are peaceable, law-abiding people. What do anarchists mean when they speak of anarchy? Webster, that's the dictionary, gives the term two definitions: chaos and the state of being without political rule. We cling to the latter definition. Our enemies hold that we believe only in the former. This actually represents a departure from her recorded stance in 1884 when she published an article on the front page of the Chicago workers' rights newspaper, The Alarm. In that article, Lucy called on workers to stand up for their rights and better working conditions. The article ended with the powerful recommendation to learn the use of explosives. The popular article was reprinted and sold on its own among anarchist circles over years. Lucy Parsons' outlook, like most of ours, evolved and changed over the course of her life. After a major shift towards industrial unionism in 1905, into the 20th century now, Lucy Parsons began editing The Liberator, a paper published by the IWW and based in Chicago. We will see the IWW, one of the most inclusive unions, show up in a coming lecture, so don't worry about them now. Through The Liberator, Lucy Parsons took a stand on other issues, for instance, women's issues, supporting a woman's right to divorce, remarry, and have access to birth control. From 1907 to 1908, Lucy Parsons organized against hunger and unemployment across the U.S., including in our own backyard in San Francisco. Lucy Parsons' Chicago hunger demonstrations in January of 1915, so not long before World War I, she pushed the American Federation of Labor, the Socialist Party, and Jane Addams Hull House to participate in a huge demonstration on 12 February that actually managed to budge the federal government. The AFL has already appeared in a lecture. Hull House and the Socialist Party are yet to come, but know that Hull House was very approved by the white middle class, so their involvement was not trivial. In 1925, Parsons began working with the newly formed Communist Party. During this period, she mainly worked with the Coalition for International Labor Defense, a Communist Party group aiding with the Scottsboro 8 and Anglo-Herndon cases. You may not know the cases, but both of them were situations where the establishment charged African-American organizers with crimes that they actually did not commit. This was Lucy Parsons' first return to the South and her first work on issues involving race. For the serious part of lecture, I will leave you with a quote that is incredibly apropos given the lecture to which this coda is attached. Parsons said, "Never be deceived that the rich will permit you to vote away their wealth." And with that, our background this time comes from a woman's gymnasium outfit from around 1895, complete with shoes. The Met calls this outfit typical, and in the sense that it is composed of a sailor-inspired midi blouse and bloomers, it is. However, the sash is an individual touch. On the lower left here is a more typical and subdued woman's gym suit, and on the right is a photo from my own research showing an ordinary woman taking part in a summer training school. Most of the women who attended this school already had jobs teaching physical training in a gymnasium somewhere in the US, and they were sharpening their skills over the summer.